Chapter 1. Ivy Hollow. Whispers. It was a mild and golden afternoon in early June, the sort that seemed to soften even the sharpest corners of village life. Sunlight filtered lazily through the trees that lined the cobbled lanes of Larkwood, dappling hedgerows, honeystone cottages, and the hands of elderly ladies pruning rose bushes with the serene care of those with nothing left to rush toward. At the heart of this picturesque calm lay Ivy Hollow, a large ivy-clad house that stood on the village's eastern edge, its stone walls hidden behind creeping greenery that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Once the proud domain of Miss Eliza Mott, it had stood silent these past 6 months, its windows blank and its garden left to riot. Miss Mott had vanished in December. No note, no luggage removed. Her bedroom slippers had remained beside the hearth, and her coat hung untouched on the hallway peg. The police had concluded she had wandered off, confused perhaps, as the elderly sometimes are. But in a village like Larkwood, such conclusions never quite satisfied. There had been murmurs, of course, first in the aisles of the grocer, then in lowered tones over stewed tea, and finally, inevitably, in louder voices as facts turned to folklore. She wouldn't have left her cat, Mrs. Simpkins declared with great certainty. Old Tom hadn't missed a meal in 8 years. Wandered, did she? Said Mr. Bowditch the butcher. Then where's her walking stick gone? She never went anywhere without it. The ivy, said little Maisie Wilkins one morning, pointing to the house as she passed it on her way to school. It eats people. That had been enough for her mother to cross the road the next time they walked that way. But now, on this pleasant afternoon, the gates to Ivy Hollow stood open once again. After a lengthy and tedious legal process, the property had finally been granted to Eliza's nephew, Mr. Giles Orford, a solicitor from London who had never once set foot in Larkwood until the day the keys were placed into his hand. Eager to ingratiate himself, or perhaps to quiet lingering suspicions, he had invited the entire village to a welcome garden tea, complete with sponge cakes, floral bunting, and a polite band of musicians who looked as though they had been hired in haste from the back of a newspaper advert. The villagers came, as they always did, armed with shortbread tins and longer memories. Miss Marple arrived alone, as was her habit. She was greeted with warmth by some, with distracted nods by others, though no one failed to notice her. One could say what they liked about Miss Marple's age, attire, or fondness for embroidery, but in matters of the mind and murder, the village had long since learned that she was to be taken very seriously indeed. Miss Marple, said Reverend Pritchard, offering a plate of cucumber sandwiches with an air of gentle apology, do try the salmon mousse. Mr. Orford had it specially brought in from London. How extravagant, she said with a smile, though I must say I always think fish prefers a more private setting. Nearby, Mrs. Cartwright was whispering to Mrs. Hale beneath her hat. Look at the state of the ivy. I dare say it's worse than when poor Eliza lived here. I wouldn't let my children play near it, Mrs. Hale muttered. It looks unnatural. Do you see how thick it's grown? It was always thick, said Miss Marple, who had drifted within earshot with the practised subtlety of a cat. Miss Mott prided herself on it, said it kept the house cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. I always thought it gave the place a rather lovely air. Mrs. Cartwright gave a quick, tight-lipped smile and returned to her plate. from Chisholm. Her spot beneath the trellis, Miss Marple surveyed the guests. She noted with interest that Giles Orford, the new heir, seemed strangely ill at ease. He laughed when prompted, nodded politely at compliments about the refreshments, but his eyes flicked often towards the garden's eastern wall, where the ivy grew thickest. A gardener had recently cleared some of the overgrowth near the base, leaving the wall's foundation partially exposed. Giles didn't like looking at it, and yet he couldn't seem to stop. Children darted between the tea tables, mothers scolded them gently, and the musicians did their best to liven the affair with a tepid rendition of Greensleeves. It was almost enough to pretend everything was entirely ordinary. And then a scream cut across the lawn like a knife through fabric. "Something in the ivy," cried a voice. Mrs. Walker, the housekeeper from the vicarage. "Oh, heavens, there's something behind the wall." The music stopped. Teacups clattered. A dozen people turned as one. "Stay back, everyone," called Mr. Orford, already pushing through the crowd towards the far wall. But it was too late. A curious cluster had already gathered, peering into the gnarled green. One of the younger boys, emboldened by the commotion, had jabbed at the ivy with a garden fork, and something pale had emerged from the wall's shadowed base. It was a hand, not just a scrap of cloth or an old glove, as someone first suggested, but a hand, a woman's hand, slender and still, jutting from the dirt and stone, half veiled by ivy tendrils. The fingers curled slightly inwards, and a broken bracelet clung loosely to the wrist. Miss Marple reached the spot at the same time as the Reverend. Her eyes were sharper than most, and though her voice remained composed, there was something in the way she looked at the wall, at the disturbed ivy, the broken earth, the angle of the wrist, that said she was already beginning to see far more than the rest. Someone gasped. Mrs. Cartwright fainted noiselessly into a patch of lavender. Mr. Orford stood frozen, face white as linen, eyes fixed on the hand. "Dear God," he said softly, "it can't be." Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. "I'm afraid it most certainly is," she said. And then quietly, almost as if it had always been there, the whisper of the village began to rise. Not loud, not yet, but like ivy, it had taken hold. Chapter 2. The village in murmur by morning. The entire village of Larkwood had heard. The news travelled not with the speed of telephones or telegrams, but with something far swifter and far more enduring. Gossip. It slipped through garden gates, coiled beneath church pews, and wrapped itself around tea kettles and front porches with the efficiency of a spider's web. They had found a body in the ivy wall at Ivy Hollow. More specifically, a woman's body, almost entirely obscured by vines pressed deep into the loose earth and stone near the garden's eastern wall. Constable Reeves had been summoned, followed shortly by a young inspector from the county named Mr. Ellicott, who looked about 20 and carried a notebook as if it might protect him from the judgment of elderly women. "I dare say it'll turn out to be poor Miss Mott," said Mrs. Simpkins to a small group huddled near the greengrocer's stall. "I knew it the moment I saw that hand. The fingers were quite unmistakable, long and elegant, like hers always were. And she always wore that silver bracelet. Did you see it? I told my Harold just last week. I said, 'She's in the garden, I'll wager, under the ivy.' You didn't say that, Mrs. Hale said flatly. Well, I thought it, Mrs. Simpkins sniffed. Outside the church, Reverend Pritchard was consulting in hushed tones with Inspector Ellicott, who, for all his starched collar and polished boots, was beginning to look frayed at the edges. "We'll need to confirm identity," Ellicott said, flipping pages in his little book. "Post-mortems. Been requested, though. Well, the bracelet is a strong indicator." Reverend Pritchard nodded. "She was a private woman, Miss Mott. Not many visitors. No enemies I ever heard of." Behind them, Miss Marple stood quite still. She wore a pale blue cardigan and carried a shopping basket half filled with rhubarb. She said nothing, merely watched, listened, observed. She had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead, and now in Larkwood, to know that secrets did not disappear with their keepers. They merely waited, quietly, patiently, beneath ivy and soil, until someone happened to look too closely. At the post office, Mrs. Cartwright was making a fuss over a letter from her niece in Birmingham, though her conversation quickly spiralled back toward Ivy Hollow. "You mark my words, it was that nephew," she said, tapping the counter with her index finger. "Giles Orford. Barely in the house 6 months and already playing host like nothing ever happened. Oh, I saw him staring at the wall before the scream, pale as milk. Guilty men always watch the place they buried something." "Do they?" asked Miss Marple, who had just stepped in behind her. Mrs. Cartwright turned with a start. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "So often the case," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "People rarely see what's directly behind them." By afternoon, the constable had cordoned off Ivy Hollow's garden with a length of twine and 2 wooden stakes. It looked more ceremonial than protective. Children on bicycles slowed as they passed. Dogs barked and were swiftly hushed. Mr. Orford had not left the house all morning, though the curtains in the drawing-room had been adjusted several times, proof that someone was peeking out. Miss Marple visited the vicarage just past 3, carrying a jar of strawberry preserves and what she politely termed some minor thoughts. Reverend Pritchard accepted both with a distracted air. "I fear this will unsettle the village," he said. "Eliza's disappearance was one thing, but this, to find her like that, buried in her own garden, it does cast a shadow over the lawn," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself into a high-backed chair near the window. "But perhaps not as suddenly as it seems." The Reverend blinked. "You think this was expected?" "Not consciously," she replied. "But I've always found people suspect far more than they say. And those who gossip most freely often know exactly what not to mention." He looked at her over the rim of his teacup. "You think someone in the village knows what happened?" "Think many people know something, Reverend, but whether it's the right something remains to be seen." She paused, gently stirring her tea, though she had added nothing to it. "Tell me, what do you recall about Miss Mott in the weeks before she vanished?" "She was quieter than usual, I suppose. Missed 2 church luncheons, which wasn't like her. Gillyflower mentioned she was seen talking to a man at the edge of the woods near the quarry path, though no one ever confirmed it. She never said much to me, but she seemed troubled." "And what about her nephew?" "Only met him twice before this business. Cordial enough. Always seemed slightly out of place, not quite village stock." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Out of place. People often try too hard to seem at home." She rose. "Thank you, Reverend. I believe I'll take a walk by Ivy Hollow. Perhaps the ivy has more to say now than it did before." As she departed, the Reverend frowned, as though something had occurred to him, but the thought slipped away before he could grasp it. Back at Ivy Hollow, a pale evening sun cast long shadows through the trees. The garden looked almost peaceful now, the spot where the hand had emerged neatly marked with a chalk outline and a scattering of upturned soil. Miss Marple paused by the gate. She bent to examine a trail of disturbed earth near the base of the wall, faint, almost imperceptible, as though someone had knelt there long before the gardener ever struck the ivy. A pair of threads hung from a nearby branch. Fine, green, silk perhaps. She touched them gently. From within the house, a figure moved behind the curtain. She did not wave. She simply watched the ivy sway. And quietly, beneath her breath, Miss Marple murmured, "Someone planted more than flowers in this garden." Chapter 3. Threads in the Hedgerow. The morning after the discovery, Inspector Ellicott returned to Ivy Hollow, his boots clean, his voice practised, and his notebook open. He asked many questions about movements, guests, family disputes, and gardening schedules, yet seemed never quite to listen to the answers. He took statements from all the villagers who had attended the tea, cross-referenced the guest list with Mr. Orford's memory, and politely but firmly asked Miss Marple to keep clear of the ivy until the area was deemed no longer sensitive. She smiled and nodded and proceeded to do precisely as she pleased. Miss Marple knew better than to waste time asking questions when people were newly frightened. Fear made them forgetful, or far too eager to recall things they hadn't seen at all. No, this part of the mystery required a softer ear and a better understanding of character than any formal questioning could yield. It was time to stitch people's habits together like pieces of a quilt. Her first stop was the grocer's, where Mrs. Hale was examining a bruised apple and trying unsuccessfully to keep her voice to herself. "I told you," she was saying to Mr. Bowditch, "that garden was cursed. Eliza never should have let that ivy grow so wild. It brings in spirits, you know. There's moisture trapped beneath it. It poisons the bricks." Mr. Bowditch looked vaguely alarmed. "Ivy's ivy, isn't it? Been climbing houses for centuries. Doesn't mean anything." "Ah, but that house has a feel about it. I've always said so. And that nephew, always looking like he's walked into the wrong drawing room." Miss Marple selected a small jar of jam and gave a delicate cough. "Good morning, dears." Mrs. Hale startled, then recovered. "Miss Marple, you'll have heard by now, of course." "One tries not to," said Miss Marple kindly, "but in Larkwood news arrives faster than the post." "Terrible business," muttered Mr. Bowditch. "Quite," said Miss Marple, "and so odd, don't you think, that a woman like Miss Mott, always so particular, should be found under ivy like that? Still wearing her bracelet and all. I'd have thought she'd never have gone into that soil willingly." Mrs. Hale pursed her lips. "You don't think she buried herself, surely?" Miss Marple chuckled lightly. "Oh, no, nothing so dramatic. But it does make one wonder what sort of person might have known that garden well enough to place her there, without being seen." Mr. Bowditch leaned in. "I always thought it odd she had the wall reinforced last year. Asked my cousin in the next village to come remortar it. Quietly, too. Never told anyone why." "Curious," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. and I suppose no one knew why she stopped attending the choir teas. Mrs. Hale shrugged. People said she was tired, but I think something changed after Christmas. She looked over her shoulder more, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple thanked them and departed with her jam, her mind already stitching a pattern. She hadn't quite made out yet. Her next visit was to the schoolhouse. Beatrice Gillyflower, the schoolmistress, lived in the narrow flat above the classrooms, and kept her windows cracked open even in poor weather, as though some part of her preferred the wind over company. She welcomed Miss Marple with the warmth of someone more accustomed to equations than tea-time conversation. "I know I'm expected to say how shocking it all is," Beatrice said, settling on the edge of a faded chair. "But I don't think it's all that surprising." "Oh?" Miss Marple said, unwrapping a packet of shortbread she'd brought. "You knew her well." "Well enough. She gave me books, told me I was wasting myself on arithmetic, said I ought to write novels. But she was wrong. People are exhausting." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You saw her the week she disappeared, I gather." Beatrice hesitated. "Briefly. She stopped me on the green, asked if I'd noticed anyone spending time near the garden. She was vague about it, said the ivy had grown thicker than she remembered. I didn't know what to say." "She didn't mention who she suspected." Beatrice shook her head. "But she looked frightened." "And the nephew?" Beatrice gave a soft snort. "Giles? I don't trust anyone who apologizes before speaking. Always makes you feel like the words coming next are going to hurt." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "What an interesting way to put it." Before leaving, Miss Marple wandered briefly through the village green. The sun was stronger that day, making the leaves sparkle, and the window glass shimmer like polished coins. From her spot by the lich gate, she spotted Constable Reeves outside Ivy Hollow, notebook in hand, trying valiantly to appear as if he were not waiting for instructions from someone younger than his own son. She approached. "No new findings, I'm afraid," he said before she asked. "Post-mortem confirms it's her, Miss Mott. No sign of blunt force or wounds, but the soil near the body had signs of belladonna residue." "Belladonna?" Miss Marple echoed. "That's interesting. A paralytic, is it not?" He nodded. "Used to be more common, herbal remedies and such. But in the wrong amount, it can mimic death. If you didn't know what to look for, you might think someone was gone long before they really were." "And how did it get there?" "No one knows. The inspectors requested further toxicology." "Quite right," she said, "though I wonder, has anyone checked Miss Mott's kitchen? I always say most mysteries can be solved by looking where people cook and where they keep their gloves." He blinked at her. "Her gloves?" "Yes, because people often remove things before doing something dreadful, and they never quite remember where they put them afterward." And with that, she walked on. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, embroidery in hand but needle unmoving. Outside, sparrows flitted along the hedge, and a gardener trimmed roses beside. The lane. It had begun to form now, a shape in the mist. Someone had placed Eliza Mott beneath the ivy, not only with care, but with knowledge. They had been inside the garden without disturbing it. They had waited until something, some fear, had kept her silent. But what had she been afraid of? Miss Marple set aside her sewing and leaned forward, watching the ivy sway in the breeze. It wasn't just a hiding place, she thought. It was a message. Chapter 4. The obvious guilty party. By the end of the week, Inspector Ellicott had made up his mind. Not publicly, of course. He still wore the cloak of investigative neutrality, still jotted in his notebook, still asked dutiful questions with his brow furrowed just enough to suggest concentration. But in a village like Larkwood, where every curt nod or hesitation becomes scripture, it was not long before the residents began whispering what they already suspected he was thinking. "It's the nephew," Mrs. Cartwright said with grim satisfaction over her mid-morning brandy. "Plain as the nose on your face. A solicitor from the city, no ties to anyone here, and just happens to inherit the whole estate after his aunt turns up buried in her own back garden." Across the lane, Mrs. Hale agreed, though in her version, Giles Orford had forged the will, poisoned the tea cakes, and fled the night of the murder, only to creep back and play host at the garden party with astonishing gall. Even Mr. Bowditch, normally disinterested in anything that didn't involve the price of lamb, shook his head gravely and muttered, "Men like that don't take kindly to waiting for things they think they deserve." The police, too, had begun circling the matter. Orford had returned to the village only once before his aunt's disappearance, staying just 3 nights. No one remembered seeing them together. According to a note left in her diary, Eliza Mott had made a brief appointment with a solicitor of her own just before she vanished, but that appointment had never been kept. When her will was finally presented, it left everything, house, land and savings, to Mr. Orford, a tidy outcome. Perhaps too tidy. "He's certainly a convenient suspect," said Inspector Ellicott to Constable Reeves as they stood just beyond the garden gate at Ivy Hollow. "Motive, means and opportunity. Though something doesn't quite fit." Reeves glanced at the ivy-covered wall. "You're thinking the timing?" "Exactly. Why wait 6 months after the disappearance to host a party? Why draw attention? Back to the garden?" Reeves shrugged. "Maybe he thought no one would look that close. Or maybe he thought the ivy had done the job of hiding it." Ellicott nodded slowly, though his frown remained. "Still, I'd feel better with something more concrete." A few streets away, Miss Marple was seated across from Giles Orford himself. He had invited her somewhat hesitantly for tea, partly from politeness and partly, Miss Marple suspected, from a need to have anyone, in the village still willing to look him in the eye. "I can't tell whether they pity me or loathe me," he said, stirring his tea with a distracted hand. "Possibly both." "The village is cautious," Miss Marple said gently. "But it doesn't always mean unkind. They simply like to make sense of things. And this hasn't made sense. Not yet." He looked up, eyes hollow. "I didn't kill her." "I didn't say you did. No. But you're wondering. Everyone is." Miss Marple regarded him for a moment. "Then tell me, what did happen that night?" He hesitated. "I don't know. I was in London, working late on a case. I hadn't spoken to Eliza in weeks. She didn't answer my last letter, but that wasn't unusual. She could be stubborn." "Was there any disagreement between you?" He gave a faint laugh. "Only about everything. She thought I was wasting my life, that I'd become cynical. She wanted me to give up law and move to Larkwood. Said I'd be happier among hedgerows. And would you have?" "No," he said, "but I did care for her. We may not have." Been close, but she was the only family I had left." Miss Marple studied him. His face was tired, but not tense. His voice held no bravado, only exhaustion. Either he was a fine actor, or he was a man caught in a place he didn't understand. She looked down at the tea set. It was mismatched, chipped saucers and one oddly ornate sugar bowl that didn't match the rest. "Was this Eliza's?" she asked, indicating the bowl. He nodded. She collected them, said she liked things with stories. "And did she ever tell you the story of this one?" He blinked. "No. Why?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "I just think that sometimes people use their favourite objects to hide their least favourite truths." Stood. "Thank you for the tea, Mr. Orford. I do hope you'll stay in the village a while longer. Ivy Hollow's been quiet too long. It might appreciate someone willing to listen." He looked surprised. "You think the house is listening?" "Oh, yes," she said. "Houses always do." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and retrieved a small notebook. Inside, she had begun recording names, movements, peculiarities, not facts in the way the police liked them, but habits, expressions, and inconsistencies. She wrote, "Giles Orford. Nervous but no signs of self-protection. Wears the house like an ill-fitting suit. Possibly being watched by someone else. Beatrice Gillyflower. Evasive. Knows more than she admits. Possibly saw someone that day. Reverend Pritchard. Anxious. Keeps referring to the peace of the village more than the victim. Mrs. Cartwright. Too quick to suspect. Likely projecting. Has strong opinions about inheritance." She tapped the end of her pencil thoughtfully. In her experience, murder rarely grew in darkness alone. It sprouted, slowly, fed by grievances, old wounds, or silent resentments, the kind that built up over years, especially in places where people smiled too much and asked too few questions. She glanced out the window toward Ivy Hollow, where the garden wall sat in shadow and the ivy shivered in the breeze. The village thought the matter settled. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust the obvious. The real killer, she suspected, was still very much in bloom. Chapter 5. The Folded Corner. The post-mortem report arrived in the village 2 days after the garden party, though only a select few were privy to its contents. Inspector Ellicott, for his part, did not make a spectacle of it. He merely tucked the slim envelope under his arm, thanked the courier, and disappeared into the vicarage for what was described by the Reverend as a quiet moment of reflection. Word trickled out all the same. "No signs of blunt force," murmured Mrs. Hale, in the bakery queue, "and no trauma to the skull. Apparently she had traces of something in her blood," added Mr. Bowditch, who claimed to have heard it from the undertaker's cousin's daughter. "Not poison exactly, but something herbal." "Belladonna," Miss Marple said softly, though no one had asked her. They all turned. "Well, that's what the constable mentioned to me," she clarified. "It's quite an old substance, derived from deadly nightshade. In large quantities, it's fatal. In smaller ones, it can cause confusion, vision problems, even the appearance of death." Mrs. Hale shuddered. "It's all too strange. Buried alive? Surely not. Not necessarily alive," Miss Marple said. but perhaps not as dead as the person responsible believed. She left the bakery with a fresh loaf tucked under her arm and a furrow in her brow. Something still itched at her, just beneath the surface, like a thread in a tightly woven sweater that had begun to pull. She returned home and went straight to her bookshelf. Among the many volumes on etiquette, wildflowers, and the peculiar tendencies of birds, she retrieved a slim, cloth-bound ledger that had once belonged to her cousin's husband, a retired pharmacist. Inside were notes on plant toxicity, home, remedies, and their effects on the nervous system. Belladonna had an entire page to itself. Miss Marple studied it for several minutes before closing the book and walking to the window. From her parlour, she had a clear view of Ivy Hollow. The police tape had been removed that morning, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. No one had seen Giles Orford since Thursday, and the curtains remained firmly drawn. She crossed the lane, pausing at the gate. The garden had been tidied, perhaps too tidied. The flower beds had been raked, the broken ivy cleared, and the bench beneath the cherry tree scrubbed so clean it looked somehow bleached. But it wasn't the garden she had come to see. It was the compost heap. Miss Mott had always kept one, tucked discreetly behind a patch of honeysuckle near the rear wall. Most of the villagers thought it unsightly, but Eliza had believed in frugality and good soil. Miss Marple found it precisely where she remembered it, now dry, flat, and recently overturned. She knelt beside it, brushing the topsoil gently with her gloved hand. And there, partially buried beneath damp leaves and broken stalks, she saw something strange. A book, or rather, what remained of one. It was a small hardback, the cloth faded, its pages swollen from exposure. She lifted it carefully and dusted off the cover. No title remained, but inside the first page, written in Eliza's unmistakable slanted hand, was the name E. Mott, 1923. It wasn't a diary nor a ledger. It was a poetry book, long-loved, well-thumbed, and thoroughly ruined now. But as Miss Marple turned the pages, one detail caught her eye. A folded corner. Crisp. Deliberate. She pried it open. The page was marked not with Eliza's handwriting, but someone else's. Tight, neat script, written in blue ink along the margin beside a poem titled The Ivy's Embrace. Not all things planted are meant to bloom. Miss Marple frowned. The poem itself was unremarkable. Something about longing and the creeping weight of time. But the line in the margin was too deliberate, too pointed. She looked again. Beneath the line, another had been added in lighter ink, almost faded. The garden will keep its secret if you do. She stood slowly, the book still in her hand. Why would someone write such a note in an old book of poetry and then toss it onto a compost heap? Why fold the page unless they meant someone to find it? Or perhaps unless they had meant someone not to. She left the garden and made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Pritchard welcomed her with mild surprise. "I hope you're not here to suggest divine intervention, Miss Marple. I've already had 2 villagers ask me whether I believe in poltergeists." "No, Reverend," she said. "I'm here to ask whether you've kept any correspondence from Miss Mott." Correspondence? She was a faithful member of the parish for nearly 4 decades. Surely she wrote now and again? He frowned. "Well, yes, we exchanged notes occasionally about flower rotas, luncheon plans, hymn selections, nothing personal." "May I see them?" He blinked. "I suppose so." He returned a few minutes later with a small box of folded letters. Miss Marple opened the first, then the second, then a third. Her expression barely shifted, but she saw it. Eliza's handwriting had changed, slightly, only in the last few notes, dated in the weeks before her disappearance. It was still her hand, but slower, a little more shaky, and with different phrasing. Where once she signed off with her customary "warmly yours," the last three ended with "sincerely." Miss Marple held them side by side. No doubt about it. Someone had been imitating her. Only someone who thought no one would notice would make such a subtle mistake. She handed the letters back. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been very helpful." "Was Tuniones, there's something you were hoping to find?" "Oh, yes," she said, "and I think I just did." That evening, she sat once more at her desk, notebook open. She added, "Hidden note in poetry book. Handwriting unknown. Margin comment," clearly referencing Eliza's silence. Faked letters. Slight discrepancies. Perhaps written after death to delay suspicion. Compost heap. Cleared recently. Why bury a book, not burn it? She underlined the last sentence, then closed her notebook with care. Somewhere in the village, someone had gone to considerable lengths to plant not just a body, but a story. And Miss Marple had just found the corner where it began to unravel. Chapter 6. Beneath the polite surface word had begun to shift again in Larkwood, not quite changing, but fermenting. The comfortable certainty that Giles Orford was to blame had begun to wrinkle at the edges, and people were starting to lean closer to one another, asking smaller, quieter questions. Miss Marple, however, was asking no questions at all. She simply listened. She was in the Rose and Thistle, the village's only public house, seated alone with a small glass of elderflower cordial and her knitting in hand. It was early evening, and the pub had only a handful of patrons, just enough for conversations to take root without drawing attention. At a nearby table, Beatrice Gillyflower sat with a drink untouched before her, flipping through a well-worn paperback. Every now and again she looked up, her eyes scanning the pub as if watching for something or someone. A few minutes later, Miss Marple's patience was rewarded when Reverend Pritchard entered. He was out of breath and looked flustered, clearly surprised to find the schoolmistress already there. Miss Marple's eyes did not linger, but her knitting slowed ever so slightly. They spoke in low tones, nothing of note at first, small pleasantries, weather. Then something in the vicar's voice shifted. He glanced toward Miss Marple, then leaned forward as if shielding a secret. Miss Marple tucked away her needles, rose, and left without a word. She had no need to eavesdrop further. The vicar had told her everything already, by accident. The next morning, she paid a visit to Ivy Hollow. Mr. Orford answered the door in shirt-sleeves, a teacup in one hand and an expression somewhere between suspicion and weariness. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Miss Marple," he said, "have they sent you to ask me more things I don't know?" "No," she replied calmly. "I came because I think you're being blamed for something you didn't do. And I suspect you're just desperate enough to help me prove who did." That got his attention. He invited her in. The house was still, but more orderly than before. Someone had been trying to put things right, straightening furniture, scrubbing scuffed baseboards, even replacing the doilies on the sitting room armrests. Miss Marple noticed the effort. But she also noticed something else. The faintest scent of lavender water, Eliza's favourite, still clung to the curtain hem near the front window. "She's very present here," Miss Marple said softly. Orford nodded. "It's maddening. She was afraid," Miss Marple continued, seating herself across from him. "I believe someone was threatening her, subtly but persistently. They may even have been trying to poison her, enough to weaken her, to make her uncertain, to make others believe she was confused. Poison!" Orford's voice cracked slightly. "You're serious?" "I am. Belladonna leaves a very particular mark, and it doesn't need to be administered in a drink. It can be rubbed into gloves, dabbed on handkerchiefs, even blended into herbal remedies, especially ones offered under the guise of care." Orford paled. "Do you know who? I have suspicions. But first, I need to understand more about your aunt's habits. She asked about the garden, the visitors, her routines. At first his answers were vague, but gradually they sharpened. She often had someone over on Thursdays, he said. Not always the same person. A few locals, Beatrice Gillyflower sometimes, and Reverend Pritchard." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Together? No," he said. "Never. Come to think of it, she always kept them apart. I asked once, and she said she didn't like mixing oil and water." "And what did they speak about?" "I wouldn't know. She'd send me out to run errands during those visits. Said I distracted her." Miss Marple rose. "One last question. Did your aunt keep her keys on her at all times?" He hesitated. "No, they hung on a hook in the kitchen. She hated the feel of metal in her pockets." "Why?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She returned to the lane just as the bell tower rang noon, and was soon knocking lightly on the schoolhouse door. "Beatrice," Gillyflower answered with a tired smile. "Miss Marple, come for a chat. If you've time." They spoke briefly, polite, measured phrases, but Miss Marple was watching the books, the scattered papers on the table, and most of all, the tea service on the sideboard. There were 2 cups, not one. Beatrice followed her gaze and flushed. "My sister visited earlier," she lied, too quickly. "Ah," Miss Marple said with an innocent nod. "She left you quite the mess." Beatrice moved to tidy the cups, but her hand trembled slightly. "I suppose I've been a little distracted." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "You were close to Eliza, weren't you?" Beatrice froze. "I admired her," she said at last. "She saw things in me others didn't. I suppose I owe her more than I realized." Miss Marple did not press. She simply thanked her and left, stopping only once on the path to glance back at the curtained window, just as it twitched closed. By sunset, the village had quieted again. Children were called indoors. The church bell marked the hour. Somewhere beyond Ivy Hollow, a pair of doves cooed softly into the falling dusk, and Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her notebook open, her thoughts unusually heavy. She wrote, 2 teacups, unexpected guest, or habit. Gillyflower's hands trembling. Guilt or fear? Pritchard and Beatrice never in the same room. Why, poetry book note, phrased like a pact. A shared secret, then underlined twice. Who benefits from silence? She closed the book. They were all hiding something. But not all of them were murderers. And the difference, Miss Marple knew, lay not in what they said, but in why they hadn't said it sooner. Chapter 7. A Second Silence. The letter arrived mid-morning, folded crisply and hand-delivered by a boy from the next village over, who claimed he had been paid £1 to run it to the Larkwood Constable's office. Constable Reeves opened the envelope, read the contents twice, and after a lengthy pause, made his way straight to Ivy Hollow. He found Giles Orford pacing the narrow hallway just inside the front door, a half-written letter on the table beside, him and an untouched cup of tea gone cold. The solicitor looked worse than he had days earlier, his shirt rumpled, his expression drawn. Reeves held out the letter. This came to us an hour ago. Orford unfolded it, and the moment his eyes reached the first line, he paled. There, in slanted handwriting, unmistakably Eliza Mott's, was a message dated just 1 week before her disappearance. To whom may concern, if anything happens to me, please look closely at the old hedge wall near the compost. It has watched more than it should. No signature, no address, just a single sheet torn from a notebook. Where did this come from? Orford asked, his voice unsteady. Reeves shook his head. No return mark, just the boy saying it was. Handed to him this morning by a woman in a green shawl. He didn't get a name. A green shawl, Orford repeated. Miss Marple was already sipping her second cup of tea when Constable Reeves arrived at her gate. "May I trouble you a moment?" he asked, cap in hand. "Certainly," she replied, ushering him in with her usual quiet grace. "You've had a letter, haven't you?" He blinked. "How did you—" "It's in your posture. Shoulders slightly high, a look of something unanswered on your brow. Not the sort of weight a man carries unless he's been handed a riddle." He explained the situation, producing the letter from his coat. Miss Marple studied it for several moments, tracing a gloved finger along the ink. "This is Eliza's hand," she murmured. "Though, look here." She pointed to the signature line. "She always underlined her name. Habit, you see. Began when she was a girl, to make her letters seem more proper. But here, nothing." "You think someone forged it?" "Not quite," said Miss Marple, "but I think this was copied, perhaps by someone who wanted the appearance of a warning without the risk of saying too much." Reeves frowned. "But why now? Why send it at all?" "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is the right question." And then, as if summoned by the thought, a commotion echoed from the village square. They reached the bakery just in time to see Mrs. Cartwright, red-faced and breathless, gesturing toward the chapel path. "Beatrice Gilliflower," she said, in a rush. "She's collapsed, right in front of the church gate." A small crowd had already formed as Miss Marple and Reeves arrived. Beatrice was seated on the ground, pale and dazed, her handbag spilled beside her. Reverend Pritchard knelt beside her, murmuring softly. "She's all right," he said quickly. "Just fainted, I think. She said she was on her way to see me." Then everything went black. Miss Marple helped gather the spilled contents of Beatrice's handbag. As she returned the items, handkerchief, coins, a small key, she noticed one unusual thing, a scrap of green fabric. Not a full shawl, just a torn corner, frayed, as if it had caught on a fence post. "You're sure she's all right?" she asked gently. "She'll be fine," said the vicar. "It's just the stress. She hasn't been sleeping well." But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the green cloth. That night the air was thick with quiet speculation. Mrs. Hale believed Beatrice had a secret illness. Mr. Bowditch suspected heartbreak. The more theatrical residents, Mrs. Walker chief among them, insisted she had seen a ghost. Miss Marple sat in her parlour once more, knitting idle in her lap. She did not believe in ghosts, but she did believe in fear. She returned to her notebook. Green, shawl, torn scrap in Beatrice's bag. Why hide it? Could she be the messenger? Eliza's letter, true warning, or planted misdirection? Reverend Pritchard, always close to Beatrice, but rarely at ease around her. Tension. She tapped her pencil twice against the page, then turned to a fresh sheet. This one she began not with observations, but a hypothesis. What if Eliza had discovered something between the vicar and Beatrice? A bond, perhaps, a shared past, a secret they had no intention of letting surface. And what if Eliza, forthright, independent Eliza, had confronted them? The next morning Miss Marple called upon Reverend Pritchard. He answered the door quickly, as if expecting someone else. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile too rehearsed. "To what do I owe?" "Just a neighbourly call," she said gently, "though I must admit I was rather concerned about Miss Gillyflower." "She's resting," the Reverend replied. "I insisted she stay home today." "How thoughtful," said Miss Marple. "You must be very close." The Reverend blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You and Beatrice," she said. "You seem connected." "We've worked together on parish business, of course," he said quickly. "Nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple echoed. "It's only I once knew a pair rather like you two, lived in Essex. He was a curate and she taught Latin. Brilliant minds, both. But they shared a secret, something from their youth. A fire, actually. Someone had died, though it was ruled accidental. But they had been there when it started. The shame of it bonded them like blood." Pritchard said nothing. Miss Marple smiled. "Funny what binds people, isn't it?" She left him standing in the doorway, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. In her notebook that night, she wrote, it wasn't only about inheritance, it was about leverage. Eliza knew something, and someone feared she might speak. She underlined the next line twice. Fear plants deeper than hate. Chapter 8. Beneath the Vicar's Collar. The morning fog had not yet lifted when Miss Marple set out again, her shoes clicking gently over the damp flagstones as she passed Ivy Hollow, its windows drawn tight like eyes that refused to look outward. Somewhere behind the gates, Giles Orford remained in anxious waiting. Yet Miss Marple had left him to stew in silence. There were more urgent matters to attend. She made her way instead to the vicarage, not for a confrontation, but a conversation, a final stitch in a pattern she could nearly, but not quite, see in full. Reverend Pritchard answered the door again, this time with the stiff, fixed expression of someone who has prepared too many explanations in advance. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone heavy. "Is it something new?" "Nothing new," she replied softly. "Just something old, something I thought you might help me understand." She stepped inside. He led her to the sitting room. The curtains were drawn, the fire unlit, a faint trace of lavender. Eliza Mott's favoured scent, still clung to the arm of one of the chairs. Perhaps a memory, or perhaps something else. Miss Marple said nothing of it. "You and Miss Gillyflower were close," she said. Pritchard's hands tightened slightly over his knees. "We served the same parish, and shared the same secret." The silence that followed was long and weighty. He bowed his head slightly. "We were young. It was complicated." Miss Marple waited. "When I came to Larkwood," he said, "I was fleeing a mistake. Beatrice had followed me, not out of affection, but because she knew I needed someone who would remain silent." "And Eliza?" Miss Marple prompted. "Eliza knew," he said simply. "Not at first, but she saw things, patterns. We thought she would tell. But she didn't." He shook his head. "Not yet. She gave us a choice. Said if we stepped away from the parish quietly, if we retired, so to speak, she'd say nothing. But she wanted a letter, a record, for the bishop, if anything ever happened. And that's what you forged?" He looked up sharply. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "She kept that letter," she said. "I believe she hid it in the poetry book that turned up in the compost." His voice cracked. "It wasn't meant to go that far." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It rarely is." He leaned back in the chair. "I didn't kill her." "No," she said again. "But I believe you covered for the person who did." His eyes searched hers for a moment, then dropped. "Beatrice?" she said gently. "She'd been unravelling for some time. Eliza saw it. You did too." "She thought Eliza would ruin me," he whispered. "Said the past would come back and take everything from us both." Miss Marple stood slowly. "It already has, I'm afraid." That afternoon she returned to Ivy Hollow. Giles Orford looked as though he hadn't left the chair by the window since she'd gone. "Did you find anything?" he asked. "I found everything," she said quietly. "But now we must confirm it." "How?" She gave him a smile that, on anyone else, might have looked kindly. On Miss Marple, it was something else entirely. A signal, a preparation, a challenge, by inviting Beatrice to tea. The invitation arrived by hand and was answered within the hour. Beatrice arrived at Miss Marple's cottage precisely at 4. She wore a pale blouse and a cardigan the colour of dried roses. She smiled, but her fingers twitched against the hem of her sleeve. Miss Marple led her to the parlour, where the tea was already laid, scones, jam, and a silver pot steaming gently. They exchanged polite nothings. The weather, the birds, the quietness of the village since the garden party. And then Miss Marple said very softly, "I've always admired Ivy." Beatrice's smile faltered. "It grows patiently," Miss Marple went on, "takes its time, but eventually it covers everything." Silence stretched between them. "I believe Eliza Mott admired it too," Miss Marple continued. "She planted it with care, but I don't think she expected it to become her tomb." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Barely. I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said. "You were frightened, Miss Gillyflower. Frightened that your past would become the village's business. Eliza was going to write to the bishop, not to destroy you, but to protect the community. She said she wouldn't," Beatrice whispered. "She changed her mind," Miss Marple replied. "Perhaps she saw something in your eyes that night. Or perhaps she smelled it. The belladonna in the tea. The way her fingers trembled more than usual. Beatrice's hands clenched around her teacup. "I didn't mean to—" she started, then stopped. Miss Marple reached forward and touched her wrist lightly. "It only takes a moment," she said, "a moment of fear, but it takes far longer to carry that moment afterward." The schoolmistress's eyes brimmed with tears. "I buried her," she said. "I thought she was gone. I thought she wouldn't wake up. I didn't mean to—" She broke off. Miss Marple didn't speak again. She simply poured another cup of tea. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops of Larkwood, Beatrice Gillyflower walked quietly to the constable's office and turned herself in. Miss Marple returned home and lit a single lamp in the window. She sat in her chair, the fire crackling gently beside her. In her notebook she wrote, "Sometimes the thing most feared is not judgment, but forgiveness." Then she closed the book and left the rest unwritten. The ivy, after all, had already said enough. Chapter 9. What the ivy covered it was the vicarage hall that Miss Marple chose for the gathering. A neutral place, quiet, comfortably austere, and most importantly, familiar. Not too grand, not too public. It was Reverend Pritchard who agreed to open it, though he had the look of a man who regretted the invitation the moment the first chair was set down. The gathering itself was not official, nor formal. There were no uniforms, no magistrates, no flash of handcuffs. Just the people who had mattered most in the days before and after Eliza Mott's death, and the one woman who had quietly untangled the truth. Constable Reeves was present, standing at the back of the room, cap in hand. Giles Orford arrived shortly after, pale but composed, his eyes scanning the room as if still unsure who exactly he ought to fear. Beatrice Gillyflower entered just before 4, escorted by the vicar himself. She wore no hat, no gloves, no excuses. Miss Marple waited until they were all seated. Then she stood, quietly, gently, and folded her hands before her. "I thought," she said in that soft, lilting voice, "it would be helpful to speak plainly now, not for scandal, not for judgment, but for understanding. Because I find that in cases like this, it is not always hatred or greed that leads to harm, but fear. And fear, like ivy, grows best when left alone." The room remained silent. "Eliza Mott," she continued, "was not a woman easily frightened. She had survived war, widowhood, the long decline of her family estate, and still she remained practical, independent, and shrewd. But she was not blind. She saw things others missed, and more than once she warned those close to her about the consequences of long-kept secrets." She turned her gaze toward the vicar. Reverend Pritchard and Miss Gillyflower were bound by a past not widely known, an event from many years ago involving the death of a classmate in a school fire. It was ruled an accident and officially forgotten, but the shame lingered. The vicar looked down at his clasped hands. When both came to Larkwood, separately, though not coincidentally, they thought the past might be left behind. It very nearly was, until Eliza recognized a reference Beatrice made during a conversation in the garden, a detail only someone present at the incident could have known. Miss Marple turned to Beatrice, who sat still and expressionless. "Eliza gave them a choice," she said. "Step away, leave quietly. Let the parish turn over without scandal. She promised not to report it if they did the right thing." "She was going to report it," Beatrice said suddenly, her voice brittle. "She said she changed her mind, that what happened should be known." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and I believe that moment, when Eliza decided silence was no longer acceptable, was the moment you acted." "I didn't mean to kill her," Beatrice whispered. "I just meant to slow her down, to make her reconsider, to give her time to forget." "You brought her tea," Miss Marple continued gently, "with belladonna in it. You'd used it before, small amounts, just enough to make her dizzy, unsure of herself. But that day the dose was too high. She collapsed," Beatrice said. "I checked for breath. I thought she was dead. I didn't know what else to do." "So you buried her in the garden," Giles said hollowly, "like a weed." Beatrice did not look at him. "She woke briefly," Miss Marple added softly. "Perhaps just once, scratched the earth, left one hand exposed before the ivy reclaimed it." Silence fell. Afterwards, Miss Marple said, "Beatrice and the vicar faked notes to make it appear Eliza had left voluntarily, but they hadn't accounted for her copy of The Ivy's Embrace, which she had used to hide a warning. And when I found it in the compost heap, I knew someone had tried to destroy the evidence, but hesitated." She looked toward Beatrice again. Perhaps guilt, perhaps something softer. Beatrice gave no reply. The room was still. Then Giles Orford stood slowly. "What happens now?" he asked, voice low. Miss Marple glanced at Constable Reeves. "She has already confessed," Reeves said quietly. "I'll escort her to Heathmere this evening." Beatrice rose. There was no outburst, no final plea. She simply walked to the constable and let him guide her from the room. The others remained seated until the sound of the outer door had fully faded. Then Miss Marple picked up her gloves and turned to go. Only the vicar stopped her. "You said it was fear," he said, "that fear caused all of this." "I still believe that," she replied gently. "And guilt? Oh, that comes later," she said. "Fear roots itself long before guilt grows." The next day Larkwood looked much as it had a fortnight earlier. Children returned to the village green. The bakery reopened its shutters, and the postman resumed whistling as he delivered his letters. But something had shifted. Ivy Hollow remained quiet, its curtains undisturbed, and the garden, once so fiercely alive, seemed for a time to hold its breath. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a modest embroidery hoop in her lap, took a final note in her book. "A garden doesn't forget, but it forgives with time and trimming." She folded the notebook closed and reached for her tea. Outside the ivy stirred in the breeze, and no one, not even the past, said another word. Chapter 10. The Roots. Remained was nearly a week after the quiet arrest of Miss Beatrice Gillyflower, when the signs of ordinary life began to return to Larkwood. The brass bell above the greengrocer's door rang cheerfully again. A new shipment of rhubarb had come in, and Mrs. Hale was heard debating whether it was too soon to plan the midsummer thought. Mrs. Simpkins, having boldly claimed to have always suspected the schoolmistress, was gently reminded by 3 separate people that she had, in fact, called Beatrice a bright and harmless girl just 2 days prior to the discovery. As for Ivy Hollow, the estate stood silent and still, its ivy now trimmed back by Constable Reeves himself, under orders to preserve the garden for ongoing inquiries. But in the court of public opinion, the case was closed. Eliza Mott, said Mr. Bowditch one afternoon as he bagged potatoes, was too clever for her own good, always poking her nose where someone would eventually slam the door. "Shiss, didn't poke," Mrs. Cartwright corrected. "She noticed. That's more dangerous." And somewhere across the village, tucked in her rose-scented parlour with tea in hand, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile. She hadn't returned to Ivy Hollow. She'd had no need. Her part, as always, had ended just before the public one began. Yet there remained a quiet matter still unresolved, one not found in police reports or whispered confessions, but in the personal knot of what might be called afterward. And it was Giles Orford who came to untie it. He arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep on a pale Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, expression softer than before. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," said Miss Marple, "though I suspect you're not here for tea." He smiled faintly. "No, ma'am." They sat in her parlour with the windows open to let in the breeze. The air smelled of grass clippings and honeysuckle, and the village bell tower chimed the half-hour in the distance. "I wanted to thank you," he said. I don't know that anyone else could have seen it." Miss Marple shook her head. "Anyone could have seen it, Mr. Orford. They simply didn't look." He nodded, then hesitated. "Ivy Hollow still belongs to me legally, but it doesn't feel like mine. Not any more. I expect it never did," she said. "You were meant to inherit stone and soil, not the stories attached to them. And yet," he said with a tired chuckle, "here I am, guardian of ghosts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ghosts are easier than people, I find. They require no explanation, only remembering." He looked down at the table. "She kept everything," he said softly. "All my letters. A pressed leaf I sent her when I was a child. A poem I wrote when I passed my solicitor's exams. She didn't say so, but she loved me." "She did?" said Miss Marple. "And I never really loved her back. Not the way I should have. Not as family." Miss Marple reached across and laid a hand gently on his. "Then you've just honoured her more honestly than you ever could in life." There was a long pause before he said, "What should I do with the house?" Miss Marple considered this, then said with her usual calm precision, "You could sell it if it pains you, but perhaps you might leave a piece of it behind, untouched, for memory, a bench beneath the ivy, a marker perhaps, not for scandal, but for peace." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I think she'd like that." They parted quietly, no grand farewells, just a thank you, a soft door click, and the sound of Giles Orford's footsteps fading down the garden path. Later that week, a short notice appeared in the parish newsletter. "In memory of Miss Eliza Mott, a bench has been placed along the eastern wall of Ivy Hollow, overlooking the garden she tended with care. All are welcome to sit. No mention of death. No mention of secrets. Just an offering of stillness." And in the weeks that followed, villagers did sit, some alone, some with neighbours. Children leaned against it during games of hide-and-seek. Couples rested there on quiet walks. And though the ivy had been trimmed back, it had begun to grow again, slowly, patiently, as ivy does. One afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the garden. No one saw her arrive. No one watched her leave. She sat on the bench with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the sunlight move across the stone. A sparrow landed on the wall beside her and chirped once, as if offering its approval. She did not speak aloud, but if she had, she might have said, "There is no puzzle without a pattern, and no pattern without patience." She remained for a while longer, then rose and returned to her cottage, where a new ball of yarn and a blank page in her notebook awaited. There would be more stories, more people, more puzzles. But this one, the riddle of the ivy-walled garden, had come quietly, fatally, and passed like a whisper carried off by the wind. And in its place, a village changed by silence, and one old woman who never stopped listening.